Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of John Harper and Danny Palm. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. John Harper was born in 1947 and lived in San Diego, California. In early 1993, he moved in with his elderly parents. They lived in a 1,200 square foot house at 2326 Helix Street in the Spring Valley neighborhood. This is near the intersection of Helix Street and Highview Lane. John occasionally worked in auto body repair, but spent much of his time using drugs like methamphetamine. He was extremely antagonistic and was involved in multiple confrontations with members of the community. For example, John tailgated vehicles, drove straight at oncoming vehicles only to swerve away at the last second as if he was willing to slam into them. John threw rocks at people, used expletives, and threatened to burn down a neighbor's house. One of his neighbors was a man named Danny Palm. Danny had served as a commander in the Navy for 29 years before retiring. He lived with his wife Carol in a house on Highview Lane, not far from where John lived. Danny had 4 worrisome run-ins with John. The first one occurred when Danny was driving on Helix Street. John was driving his El Camino in the opposite direction when he veered into Danny's lane. The second incident occurred when Danny was a passenger in a vehicle driven by a man named Charles. They were driving from Highview Lane to Helix Street when John pulled up behind them at high speed, turned on his high beams, and tailgated. Charles pulled over to let John by. John yelled, "Don't blank with me. I know where you live." The third run-in occurred in April 1995. Danny turned onto Highview Lane, and John pulled up behind him quickly in a Ford F-250 pickup truck and slammed on the brakes. He did this 3 times. The fourth incident occurred on May 19, 1995. Danny responded to the scene of a collision after hearing a loud bang. A car had collided with a telephone pole. John was there in his pickup truck. Neighbors were accusing John of causing the collision. When Danny was taking photographs to document the incident, John approached him and said, "I'm going to blank you up." Starting in early 1995, residents in the area held meetings to discuss the situation with John Harper. They wrote a letter to his parents, but nothing happened. When they went to the police, they were told to document all John's activities. Danny was a meticulous and detail-oriented individual. He was one of the people who monitored John's bad behavior. He documented over 150 incidents involving over 40 neighbors. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On August 3, 1995, John Harper was charged with assault with a deadly object and reckless driving in connection with an incident that happened sometime earlier. A woman named Melody Hurt accused John of tailgating her and bumping into her car. She pulled into a driveway to get away from him, but he continued following her. Finally, Melody made it to a school where other people were present, and John discontinued his pursuit. John's trial started on November 22, 1995. Danny Palm testified against John at this trial, something that undoubtedly angered John. A mistrial was declared after the jury failed to reach a unanimous verdict. They were 8-4 in favor of conviction. On November 28, 1995, before the case could be tried again, 48-year-old John Harper pleaded guilty to reckless driving and received probation. He drove his El Camino back to his neighborhood and parked in front of Danny's house, as if he wanted to intimidate Danny and Danny's wife Carol. A few minutes later, the El Camino moved down the hill. Danny went outside and watched John as John continued down Highview Lane. He then climbed in his tan Acura and followed John. Danny had a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol plus 2 magazines containing 7 cartridges each. Danny saw John's El Camino stop on the road down the hill. John was talking to a neighbor. After the neighbor walked away, John pulled forward another 10 or 20 feet and off to the right-hand side. He waved his arm for Danny to pass him. Danny pulled up alongside Johnny's El Camino. Using his pistol, he shot John 1 time between the eyes. John's El Camino rolled down the hill and hit a tree. He was dead at this point, but Danny wasn't done yet. He followed the El Camino down the hill, exited his Acura, pointed his pistol at John, and fired 6 more times, emptying the magazine. Danny then reloaded and fired 6 more times. Out of the 13 shots Danny fired in total, John was struck 9 times. Danny hid his pistol in a nearby canyon and went back to his house on Highview Lane. He left the one remaining cartridge in the chamber of his weapon. The police arrived at the scene and figured out who the shooter was. They confronted Danny 2 hours and 40 minutes after he killed John and asked him where the gun was. Danny responded, "What gun?" Danny was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. On May 16, 1996, he went on trial. Here is Danny's account of what happened on the day he killed John. Danny said that he followed John because he was worried that John was going to a neighbor's house to cause harm. He indicated that he was absolutely terrified. He believed that going home was not an option because his wife was there. Danny said, quote, "I was panic-stricken. I froze. I felt pressure in my face, heat in my face. I was hyperventilating. I felt there was no way to avoid some kind of confrontation, that he was demanding it. And I, after some number of seconds, I eased my foot off the brake and I coasted down until my car was side by side with him," unquote. When he pulled up next to John, Danny felt like prey for a predator. Danny held up his pistol and inserted a magazine so John could see it. Danny said, quote, "I still felt that he was a threat, and I felt he was forcing me to confront him, that he had demanded a confrontation, that he wasn't going to leave the neighborhood without one," unquote. Danny then manually cycled the action to chamber a round. Seeing this, John said, quote, "You and your family are as good as dead," unquote. At this point, Danny blacked out. He heard a faint pop of the first round, but didn't remember anything after that. There was no memory of emptying the magazine, reloading, and continuing to shoot. On June 5, 1996, the jury found Danny Palm not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty of second-degree murder. He was facing a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. Responding to a petition filed by Danny's new attorney, the judge held a hearing on April 17, 1997. The judge said that the jury wrongly convicted Danny of second-degree murder. He accused John Harper of being a jerk and said, quote, "Not all victims come into court completely pure and innocent. In the real world, occasionally, victims bring about their own death," unquote. The judge reduced Danny's conviction to voluntary manslaughter and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. In 2004, Danny Palm was released. Now moving to my analysis. Many of Danny Palm's supporters believed that he never should have been convicted of anything, not murder, not manslaughter, nothing at all. They argued that he was a hero who was responding to John Harper's never-ending threats and harassment. At worst, Danny was guilty of mounting an imperfect self-defense. The state, of course, disagreed. They argued that no matter how terrible John Harper was, Danny Palm did not have the right to kill him. They were not happy about the conviction being reduced from second-degree murder to voluntary manslaughter. Family members of John were also not pleased by this. John Harper's father said, quote, "Basically, our son was murdered for 2 reasons, reckless driving and to satisfy the ego of Danny Palm," unquote. John's sister said, quote, "The judge's decision was an affront to my sense of fairness," unquote. This brings me to the question, was Danny Palm guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Danny volunteered to be one of the people who documented John's behavior. The state argued that his extremely detailed record-keeping was consistent with being obsessed. On the day of the shooting, Danny followed John, shot him in the head, then followed him again as John's car rolled down the hill, and shot at him 12 more times. John was unarmed at the time. He did not represent an imminent threat to Danny. Even though John was extremely antagonistic, one could argue that Danny was the aggressor this time. After the shooting, Danny hid the weapon he used to kill John, then pretended like he didn't know what the police were talking about when they confronted him looking for the gun. Danny's story about blacking out doesn't make any sense. He would have people believe that, conveniently, he forgot that he fired his weapon 13 times. Danny didn't seem to have any memory problems for other activities around the same time, just the shooting. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Danny had a long and productive career in the Navy as a combat systems inspector. He had no criminal record and was described as someone who followed the rules. Danny had many reasons to be fearful of John. Over 40 people had accused John of being involved in about 150 different incidents. He aggressively tailgated vehicles, drove his vehicle toward people as if he was going to hit them, threatened to burn down a house, and harassed people. One neighbor described John as an unstoppable, drug-crazed terrorist. Overwhelmingly, neighbors supported Danny Palm, with many saying things like he was a hero for standing up to John Harper. When John was released on bail after being arrested for the attack on Melody Hurt, he said, quote, "I know my neighbors have done this to me. If they think it was bad before, just wait until they see me now," unquote. On the day John pleaded guilty to reckless driving, Danny reasonably believed that John was very upset. John was looking to even the score with the neighbors who he blamed for his arrest. Danny had testified during John's trial months earlier, the one that ended in a mistrial, so he was on John's naughty list. One could argue that John initiated the confrontation by stopping in front of Danny's house to intimidate him. John went looking for trouble. Danny was minding his own business. The idea of carrying a pistol outside only came to Danny after John provoked him. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Danny Palm was guilty of murder? No, he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury made a mistake in this case when they convicted him of second-degree murder, and the judge fixed this mistake. Danny was guilty of voluntary manslaughter. He should not have killed John Harper, but John provoked the confrontation not only on the day he was killed, but in the years leading up to his death. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. John Harper was self-centered, impulsive, immature, irresponsible, lazy, antagonistic, aggressive, angry, violent, vindictive, petty, cold, callous, erratic, malicious, sensation-seeking, impatient, had low frustration tolerance, had a sense of entitlement, and failed to regulate his intake of substances. For years, he terrorized his neighbors, as well as non-residents who happened to be driving through the area. Due to problems with the local police, they repeatedly failed to stop John Harper. Neighbors became increasingly frustrated with his bad behavior. There did not seem to be an end in sight. If the police were not going to act, who was going to stand up against this bully? When John was charged with the attack on Melody, neighbors thought that he may finally go to prison, but a hung jury and a guilty plea to a lesser charge derailed their dreams. Right before pleading guilty to reckless driving, John used methamphetamine. It was in his system when he died. He was ready for revenge. When he returned to his neighborhood, John immediately targeted Danny by parking in front of his house. After years of being tormented and seeing his neighbors paralyzed in fear by John Harper, Danny Palm had enough. Danny chased John down with the intent of standing up to him, to teach him that he was not going to continue his reign of terror. This was going to end today. Danny's gun was not even loaded when he left his house. His intent probably wasn't to kill John, at least not at that point. When Danny confronted John, he showed him his pistol and racked the slide, but John was not impressed. He unwisely challenged Danny by saying, "You and your family are as good as dead." This is when Danny decided that John needed to die. He killed him with one shot to the head, but that wasn't enough, because John Harper wasn't just a man anymore. He had been elevated into some type of mythical monster, a seemingly unstoppable maniac who was destined to kill someone. Almost like some type of villain from a nightmare or a horror movie, it was difficult for Danny to believe that he had actually neutralized the threat. He had managed to slay the beast, but the instinct to finish the job remained. This is why he followed John down the hill and fired at him 12 more times. The shooting started due to fear, but morphed into relief. With each shot, Danny's disbelief in his ability to stop John eased a little bit. Every flying bullet added a modicum of comfort, releasing years of tension, desperation, and helplessness. Each squeeze of the trigger imparted a little more peace of mind for Danny and the community. There would be no more threats, no more tailgating, no more living in fear. For the first time in years, the neighborhood could breathe a sigh of relief. Danny Palm was willing to pay the price for that freedom, even if it meant sacrificing his own. Those are my thoughts on the case of John Harper and Danny Palm. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Just a reminder that I have a Patreon account which features over 300 pre-release videos. These videos are of the same quality as the videos that I release to the public. When I put a video in pre-release status, it often stays that way for several months, if not a year. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video.